Welcome back, everyone. Today we'll be embarking on a deep dive that many of you have requested. We're going to meticulously dissect the first week of World War II.
It's a week that's, well, overshadowed often by the sheer scale of what World War II became, right? But understanding these initial days is crucial for grasping how quickly global tensions could boil over, how seemingly small events could actually contribute to a massive catastrophe.
Absolutely. It's a chain reaction, really. So let's set the stage. August 28th, 1939, a Monday. Diplomats are scrambling, trying to avert war. But then in Poland, this jarring act of sabotage hits, the bombing of the Tarnów rail station.
Yeah, a stark reminder right from the start that things are escalating. This attack, attributed to German agents, resulted in 20 deaths, 35 injuries. It was a deliberate move by Germany to, well, sow chaos, to instill fear, and to disrupt crucial infrastructure in Poland.
It really sets a grim tone for the days that follow. Now, as this bombing is happening on that same day, we have British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain desperately trying to negotiate with Hitler.
Right. Chamberlain was really pushing for appeasement, believing that if they could just give Hitler some of what he wanted, they could prevent a larger war. He was working through a Swedish intermediary, a guy named Birger Dollerus, but Hitler's demands were, well, they were becoming more and more unreasonable, especially when it came to the free city of Danzig.
Danzig was this incredibly tense flashpoint. It had a largely German population, but it was under League of Nations control. There were pro-German demonstrations happening, calls for annexation. It was really limiting the ability of Polish authorities to even keep order.
Exactly. Hitler saw this as an opportunity, of course, to exploit the situation, push his expansionist goals. Danzig was a strategically vital port city. Control of it meant control of a key access point to the Baltic Sea.
And all of this is happening as the world watches. Tensions are rising everywhere. Germany's already mobilizing its forces, shifting its economy towards war production.
Yeah.
They even started rationing essential goods, things like shoes and clothing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this mobilization was a clear sign that Germany was preparing for war, even while they were still talking diplomacy. They were sending a message, that they were ready and willing to use force to get what they wanted.
Now, what about Italy? They were allied with Germany through the Pact of Steyr, weren't they?
They were. But Mussolini, he was in a tricky spot. He wanted to expand Italy's influence, sure, but he also didn't want to jump headfirst into a war that could be disastrous for Italy. He was playing it cautiously, watching the situation closely.
Meanwhile, both France and Britain are seeing the writing on the wall. They start increasing their own military readiness, mobilizing troops, shoring up defenses. They're preparing for the possibility of a conflict.
Yeah, it was a massive undertaking, particularly for France. It meant recalling reservists, moving troops and equipment, basically preparing for a war on a scale that Europe hadn't seen since the First World War.
And this is all just the lead up. We're still on August 28th. We've got a whole week to unpack.
And it wasn't just the scale of it, right? The logistics were incredible, this whole mobilization effort. I mean, imagine trying to coordinate all of that in 1939.
Oh, absolutely. And things just kept getting more tense. We moved to Tuesday, August 29th, and Hitler really throws a wrench in the works. He issues a 24-hour ultimatum. He demands a Polish emissary to arrive in Berlin for negotiations.
It was seen as a blatant attempt, really, to sabotage any chance of a peaceful resolution. I mean, the deadline was incredibly short, and the demands themselves, well, no one was even sure what they were.
It put Poland in an impossible position. And all the while, Chamberlain's still trying to maintain some hope. He addresses the House of Commons, reaffirms Britain's commitment to Poland, even says the British people are said sometimes to be slow to make up their minds, but having made them up, they do not readily let go.
Powerful words. It really captured that blend of, reluctance to go to war, but also recognition that appeasement, hadn't worked. They had to stand up to Hitler.
Poland, meanwhile, refuses to send an envoy to Berlin. They weren't about to bow to these pressure tactics. And in a secret move, they activate what was called the Peking Plan. They send 3 of their destroyers to the United Kingdom to keep them from falling into German hands.
Smart move, strategically. Poland knew their navy was vulnerable, and they wanted to preserve what they could. It was a way of ensuring that at least some part of their fleet could continue to fight, potentially alongside the Allies, if it came to that.
And then, adding to the tension, Slovakia enters the picture.
Right.
Under German influence, of course, they declare martial law, align themselves more closely with the Nazi regime. Suddenly, Poland's even more isolated, surrounded by hostile forces.
Yeah, Slovakia's actions really showed just how much influence Germany was gaining in Eastern Europe. It was another strategic victory for Hitler, tightening the grip on Poland.
The British government, in response to all this, issues a clear warning to Germany. They emphasize their support for Poland's sovereignty, making clear that there will be serious consequences if they don't find a peaceful solution.
It was a firm warning, but even then, there was still a glimmer of hope maybe that diplomacy could prevail. But then, the German-French border closes. Symbolically, practically, that was a huge signal, a clear sign that things were breaking down.
Wednesday, August 30th, rolls around, and the illusion of diplomacy starts to crumble even further. Hitler seizes on the fact that Poland didn't meet his deadline, uses it to paint them as uncooperative, intransigent.
Propaganda in full swing. He was controlling the narrative, justifying his actions to the German people and the world. Anti-Polish sentiment was being whipped up, tensions rising even higher.
We also have this tense meeting between the British ambassador, Henderson, and the German foreign minister, Ribbentrop. Ribbentrop lays out Germany's demands, but the British, they find them unacceptable.
Oh, those demands were outrageous, including annexing Danzig, creating a German corridor through Polish territory. And Ribbentrop wouldn't even put them in writing, just made it all the more clear that Germany wasn't negotiating in good faith.
And through all of this, Poland's still defiant. They refuse to negotiate under threat, continue preparing for the possibility of war.
Brave, absolutely. But they were facing a dire situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned. They knew that resistance would be costly, but they were determined to defend their country.
The world's watching. Everyone's trying to figure out what to do. Mussolini, sensing that war's about to break out, he actually proposes a peace conference. But it doesn't get much support. The timing's all wrong. And frankly, no one really trusts Hitler at this point.
It was a nice thought, maybe, but completely unrealistic given the circumstances. The train had left the station, diplomacy was failing, the momentum towards war was just too strong.
But while all this is happening in Europe, tensions are flaring up elsewhere, too. In Japan, they appoint a new prime minister, Nobuyuki Abe, a general with a pretty hawkish reputation.
Definitely raised concerns about Japan's intentions. Abe's military background and, well, his views suggested he might be more willing to use force to achieve Japan's goals, especially in East Asia.
Meanwhile, the Swiss, famously neutral, they elect Henri Guisan as general of the Swiss army. It was a position that had been vacant for almost a century. They also started adopting this national redoubt strategy, making it clear they're ready to defend their neutrality no matter what.
It really shows how widespread the fear of war was, even in countries that traditionally stayed out of conflicts. They knew that no one would be completely untouched if a major war broke out in Europe.
Even tiny Liechtenstein declares its neutrality. This thing's affecting everyone.
It's a domino effect, really. These declarations, they're symbolic, sure, but they also reflect the reality of the situation. Smaller countries, they have limited power to influence the big players, so they're trying to protect themselves, stay out of the crossfire.
And then we come to Thursday, August 31st, and things really start to accelerate towards the inevitable. Hitler finalizes his invasion plans, issues Directive Number 1. The attack on Poland is set for dawn on September 1st.
A chilling document, really. Laid out the whole operation, codenamed Operation Fall Weiss. It was meticulously planned, ruthless. It was the blueprint for the Blitzkrieg.
And then, in a truly cynical move, German forces stage this false flag attack. They target a radio station in Gleiwitz, near the German-Polish border. This becomes known as the Gleiwitz Incident.
A classic example of Nazi propaganda and deception. They used this staged attack to blame Poland, to make it look like they were the aggressors, to give themselves a justification for the invasion.
Meanwhile, over in Moscow, we have the ratification of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, signed just a week earlier, it had this secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence.
This pact, it was a stroke of genius for Hitler, strategically speaking. It took away the threat of a two-front war, meant he could focus on conquering Poland without worrying about the Soviets coming in from the east.
But it also showed Stalin's hand, his own ambitions in the region. That secret protocol gave the Soviets the green light to annex eastern Poland, the Baltic states, parts of Finland. They were expanding their territory and influence just as much as Hitler was.
A dark moment, really. The pact was a betrayal of Poland, and it foreshadowed the horrors that were coming to Eastern Europe. It was all about realpolitik, national interest trumping any kind of moral considerations.
As all of this is going on, Britain and France are moving towards full mobilization. The Royal Navy goes on high alert. They're calling up reserves, starting civilian evacuations, especially children.
The scale of these preparations, it was a clear sign of how serious things were. Millions of men mobilized, civilian life disrupted. The world was bracing itself for a massive conflict.
The British government, they make one last attempt to stop the war. They issue an ultimatum to Germany, demand they withdraw their forces from Poland. France makes the same demand. They're standing by their commitments.
But by this point, it was almost certainly too late. Hitler had already made his decision. He wasn't going to back down.
Germany just ignores them. Complete silence. Their intentions are clear. The world holds its breath, waits for the inevitable.
That silence was deafening. The failure of diplomacy, the inevitability of war, it was palpable. And then, Friday, September 1st, 1939 arrives. At dawn, German forces, spearheaded by the Luftwaffe, launched their attack on Poland. World War II had begun.
One of the first casualties is Corporal Piotr Koniecka. He was a Polish soldier killed defending a border post against a German sabotage unit. It's a tragic reminder that this conflict, it's going to have a devastating human cost.
Absolutely. Konieczka's death, it represents all the countless lives that would be lost, all the individual tragedies that make up the larger narrative of war.
The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, it had been anchored in Danzig, supposedly on a courtesy visit. But at 4:45 a.m., it opens fire on the Polish military transit depot at Westerplatte. It's the opening salvo of the assault. And then the Luftwaffe launches wave after wave of bombing raids across Poland.
The attack on Westerplatte, it became a symbol of Polish resistance. It was a small peninsula defended by this determined Polish garrison. They held out for 7 days against overwhelming odds. It's a testament to their courage and determination.
The Polish Air Force, they fought back as best they could. They even scored the first Allied air victory of the war in a dogfight near Krakow.
A small victory, maybe, but a victory nonetheless. It was a morale boost for the Poles, a sign that they weren't going to give up without a fight.
As the German blitzkrieg rolls across Poland, Hitler, in full military uniform, addresses the Reichstag in Berlin. He gives this dramatic speech, justifies the invasion, portrays Poland as the aggressor, Germany as the victim.
Pure propaganda. He was a master manipulator, distorting the facts, using inflammatory rhetoric to rally the German people, to demonize the enemy.
He declares himself the first soldier of the German Reich, completely embracing this image of himself as a wartime leader, willing to fight alongside his people.
It was all about consolidating his power, reinforcing that cult of personality.
By the end of the first day, German forces have made significant gains. They're pushing deep into Poland. The Polish army, they're fighting bravely, but they're outmatched. They just don't have the equipment or the tactics to withstand this kind of onslaught.
The Blitzkrieg, it took everyone by surprise. The speed, the firepower, it was a completely new way of waging war, and traditional defenses just couldn't hold up against it.
The world was watching, horrified, as a new global conflict took shape.
It was the end of an era. The peace that had followed World War I, it was shattered, and the world was plunged into another conflict, one that would be even more devastating, more far-reaching than the last.
Saturday, September 2nd, 1939, the second day of the war. The Polish government officially declares war on Germany. It's a formality, really, but it's also a powerful act of defiance.
It showed that they weren't giving up. They were determined to fight for their independence, even though the odds were stacked against them.
Fighting continues. The Germans are advancing further into Poland. There's a major engagement at Borowa Góra. The Polish forces put up a fierce resistance, but ultimately they're overwhelmed.
It was a classic example of the mismatch between the two armies. The Poles, they were brave, but they just didn't have the resources to match the German firepower.
And then, in a daring move, Polish bombers conduct a raid on a chemical factory in Ohlau, Germany. The damage is minimal, but it's a symbolic strike. Shows they're willing to hit back.
It was a morale booster for the Poles, a sign that they weren't going to be intimidated by the German war machine.
On the international front, Mussolini's still trying to stay out of the war. He proposes another peace conference, but it's quickly rejected by Britain and France.
Mussolini, he was all about self-interest. He wasn't ready to commit to war. He was hoping to use the crisis to his advantage, maybe gain some concessions.
But the Allies, they're outraged by Germany's aggression. They're determined to honor their commitments to Poland.
It showed a growing resolve on their part. They knew that Hitler couldn't be appeased. They had to take a stand.
The French Prime Minister, Edouard Daladier, he gives a rousing speech to the French Chamber of Deputies. He reaffirms France's commitment to defending Poland, talks about the need to resist tyranny.
It was a rallying cry for the French people. He acknowledged the sacrifices that would be required, but he made it clear that they were fighting for a just cause.
And then, in a chilling reminder of the darkness that was engulfing Europe, The Stutthof concentration camp is established near Danzig. It starts as a prison for Polish political prisoners, but it would eventually become a major extermination center during the Holocaust.
It's a sign of the horrors that are to come. One of the first concentration camps established during the war, a foreshadowing of the systematic persecution and genocide that would define the Nazi regime.
Meanwhile, Ireland declares neutrality, hoping to stay out of the conflict.
Neutrality was a complex issue for Ireland. They had their own historical grievances with Britain, and they were wary of getting dragged into another European war.
The British, after their ultimatum expires, deliver another formal demand to Germany, insisting on the withdrawal of their forces from Poland. But again, there's no response from Berlin.
The silence spoke volumes. It was clear that diplomacy had failed. Hitler was determined to have his war.
Sunday, September 3rd, 1939. A day that many knew was coming, but still, a day that changed the world. It was almost inevitable at this point. No response from Germany to the ultimatum. Their forces are still pushing deeper into Poland. And so, at 11 a.m. London time, Britain formally declares war on Germany.
Prime Minister Chamberlain, he made the announcement over the radio, and it was a somber moment, a turning point in history. The British Empire, all its might, all its resources, now officially at war with Nazi Germany.
And just a little over an hour later, at 5:00 p.m. Paris time, France makes their own declaration of war against Germany. Their commitment to Poland was unwavering. Plus, they knew that if they didn't stop Hitler now, he would just keep going.
And with France joining the fight, the Allied front against Germany solidified. But it also meant that the war was going to be fought on multiple fronts, a much wider, much more complex conflict.
King George VI, he addressed the British people and the Empire in a radio broadcast, urging them to stay strong, stay united in the face of this enormous challenge.
A powerful speech. He knew this was going to be a long, hard fight, but he had faith in the British people, their resilience, their determination.
And across the Atlantic, President Roosevelt gives one of his famous fireside chats, talks to the American people, reaffirms America's neutrality, but you can tell he's deeply concerned about what's happening in Europe.
America wasn't ready to jump into the war just yet, but Roosevelt knew that the threat of Nazi Germany was something they couldn't ignore forever.
And while all this is going on, the war at sea has already begun. A British passenger liner, the SS Athenia, is torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland.
A civilian ship, over 1,100 passengers, including Americans, lost their lives. It was a shocking act, really highlighted the brutality of unrestricted submarine warfare.
Outrage around the world, and it really underscored the potential for the conflict to spread, to draw in other nations.
Absolutely. No one was truly safe from this war, and the sinking of the Athenia was a stark reminder of that.
Australia and New Zealand quickly declare war on Germany, showing their solidarity with Britain, adding to the growing number of nations arrayed against Hitler.
The British Empire was mobilizing its forces from all corners of the globe, a truly global response to the Nazi threat.
And even though the main fighting was happening on land, Britain launches its first defensive operation. The RAF, they sent bombers over the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. It was a leaflet drop, mainly propaganda, but it was a sign that Britain was ready to take the fight to the enemy.
It was also the beginning of the air war against Germany, a foreshadowing of the massive bombing campaigns that would come later.
Hitler, meanwhile, he's already thinking ahead. He issues Directive Number 2, orders the German army to start preparing for a possible attack from France and Britain. He knows that conquering Poland is just the first step.
He was a master strategist, always thinking several moves ahead. He knew this war was going to be a long one, and he was already planning for the next phase, the confrontation with the Western powers.
That first week of World War II, it was a whirlwind, wasn't it? From tense diplomacy to all-out war in just a few days. The invasion of Poland, it was a clear act of aggression, and it shattered the peace that had followed World War I, a peace that was already fragile.
And it set in motion this chain of events that would have a devastating impact on the entire world. Millions of lives lost, countries destroyed, the whole global order shaken to its core.
It's a reminder that peace is precious, that we can't take it for granted. And it's a reminder of the human cost of conflict, the sacrifices that are made, the suffering that endures. We have to learn from the past, do everything we can to prevent such tragedies from happening again.
Absolutely. It's a lesson we can never afford to forget.